A few years ago, when my friend Jason and I were just kids in school, the world felt like it was measured in loose change and the things we couldn't afford. We were perpetually broke, navigating that awkward age where you're too old for handouts, but too young for a real job. So when Mr. Johnson, a reclusive old man from the edge of town whose face was as cracked and weathered as the paint on his house, offered us a job cleaning his old abandoned property after school, we practically fell over ourselves to say yes. The house stood on a forgotten lane, choked by weeds and shadowed by overgrown oak trees that seemed to claw at its decaying facade. It was a place kids told stories about, a skeletal structure that loomed in the local imagination. He said he'd pay us good money, more than we could make in a month of odd jobs, and we needed it for sure. The promise of cash was a bright, shining lure that blinded us to the palpable darkness clinging to that property. Little did we know that the house held secrets darker than anything we could imagine, secrets that were waiting patiently in the dust and the silence. The first time we stepped into that house, I felt a chill run down my spine, a cold that had nothing to do with the autumn air outside. It was a profound, unnatural cold, the kind that seems to emanate from the very bones of a place. The air itself felt heavy, thick with a silent oppressive weight, like stepping into a pocket of forgotten time where the atmosphere was saturated with some kind of ancient sorrow or malice. But Jason and I, being young and full of that foolish bravado that passes for courage, just looked at each other, gave a nervous laugh, and shrugged it off. We were here for the money, not to get spooked by a drafty old house. We got to work, our initial task being to simply make the place breathable again. The dust was a character in itself, a thick, gray blanket that covered everything, muffling sound and stirring in ghostly plumes with every step we took. The cobwebs were architectural, marvels of neglect, strung from every corner, draping over furniture like macabre shrouds. Still, we rolled up our sleeves and got to cleaning, our youthful energy a stark contrast to the stagnant decay around us. We started in the foyer, the grand staircase, a shadowy spine leading up into darkness. As we worked our way through the downstairs rooms, a strange feeling began to creep over me, a persistent sense of being watched. I'd glance over my shoulder, expecting to see Mr. Johnson checking in on us, but there was never anyone there. The house groaned and settled around us, a symphony of creaks and sighs that we initially dismissed as the complaints of old wood. As we moved into the living room, a vast, cavernous space where sunlight struggled to penetrate the grimy windows, something caught my eye. In the far corner of the room, perched on an old, dusty mahogany shelf, there it sat. It was a doll, but not just any doll, not the kind you'd find in a child's playroom. This one looked like it had seen better days, centuries ago. Its porcelain face was a roadmap of fine cracks, a web of fissures that gave its expression a fractured, almost pained look. Its dress, once a vibrant blue, was faded to a dingy gray, tattered and stained with age. But it was the eyes that truly held me captive. They were glassy, vacant orbs that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, and they appeared to follow us as we moved around the room. There was an intelligence in that gaze, a cold, calculating awareness that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. "Creepy," Jason muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, losing his usual cocky edge. He'd seen it too. I nodded in agreement, a shiver tracing a cold path down my spine. The doll was a focal point of wrongness in a house already saturated with it. But we had a job to do, and the thought of Mr. Johnson's payment was a powerful motivator. We tried to push the thought of the doll out of our minds, turning our backs on it and focusing on the rhythm of scrubbing and sweeping. The days bled into one another, each afternoon spent within the suffocating embrace of the house. And as the days went on, the strange things started happening more frequently, escalating from subtle unease to undeniable phenomena. Objects would move on their own. A broom we'd left leaning against a wall would be found lying in the middle of the floor. A dusty book on a mantelpiece would be opened to a different page. We'd hear whispers, faint and sibilant, echoing through the empty halls when we were on opposite ends of the house. At first we tried to rationalize it, to brush it off as our imagination playing tricks on us in the spooky setting. We'd accuse each other of moving things as a joke, but the denials were too quick, too genuine. Deep down, we both knew something was not right about that house, and the feeling was beginning to curdle from nervous excitement into genuine fear. The sense of being watched intensified, sometimes feeling so direct it was as if someone were standing right behind me, their cold breath on my neck. Then, one evening, as we were finishing up our cleaning for the day, the last of the week's sunlight failing outside, we heard it, a soft giggle, high and thin like the tinkling of broken glass, coming from the living room. It was a child's laugh, but it was utterly devoid of joy. Jason froze, the rag in his hand dropping to the floor. His eyes were wide with a stark primal fear that mirrored my own. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice trembling so much the words were barely coherent. I nodded, my heart pounding a frantic, painful rhythm against my ribs. The sound had been clear, unmistakable, and it had sliced through the heavy silence of the house, like a razor. Together, driven by a morbid curiosity that outweighed our terror, we slowly made our way toward the living room. our footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the silence. We crept to the doorway, peering in, and there it was, the source of our dread, the doll. But this time it was different. It was no longer sitting demurely on its shelf. It was now on the floor, in the very center of the room, as if it had been placed there for a performance. And its face, its cracked porcelain face, seemed contorted. The subtle lines of its painted mouth pulled upwards into a sinister, triumphant grin. Its glassy eyes, which once seemed to follow us, now gleamed with an active, undeniable malice. I felt that icy chill run down my spine again, but this time it was a paralyzing wave of pure terror. I stared at the doll, unable to tear my eyes away. It was like it was alive, a sentient thing wearing the mask of a toy, and it was watching us, waiting for us to make a move, savoring our fear. Without a word, a silent, desperate agreement passing between us, Jason decided to confront it. He reached out, his hands trembling violently with a mixture of fear and adrenaline, and grabbed the doll. But as soon as his fingers made contact with the cold porcelain, a scream echoed through the house. It wasn't Jason's scream, and it wasn't mine. It was a high-pitched spectral shriek that seemed to come from the very walls around us. A sound of pure agony and rage that vibrated through the floorboards and into our bones, freezing us in our tracks. The walls of the house groaned in response, a deep guttural sound like a waking beast. The floorboards creaked and buckled beneath our feet as if under an immense unseen weight. Then, in an instant, everything went silent. A dead, profound silence that was more terrifying than the scream. We stood there, frozen in the grip of a fear so absolute it felt like a physical force, unsure of what to do next, our minds refusing to process what had just happened. As if on cue, the front door burst open and Mr. Johnson rushed into the room, his face pale with a terror that surpassed even our own asterisk. "What's going on?" he demanded, his voice shaking, his eyes darting around the room before landing on the doll in Jason's petrified grasp. I tried to speak, to explain the giggle, the grin, the scream, but no words would come out. My throat was constricted by fear. Instead, I simply raised a trembling hand and pointed at the doll. Mr. Johnson's eyes widened as he took in the scene before him, a look of grim understanding dawning on his face. He hadn't been ignorant of this, he had known all along. Without another word, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden box. "This," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, heavy with a terrible weight, "is why I hired you boys. I needed the house to be disturbed. I needed her to show herself." With shaking hands, he opened the box, revealing a small glass vial filled with a dark, viscous liquid. Without hesitation, he moved towards Jason, uncorked the vial, and began to pour the liquid over the doll's head. Muttering words in a language I couldn't understand, a guttural ancient tongue that felt wrong on his lips. As the dark liquid trickled over the doll's cracked face, it sizzled as if touching hot metal. A thin wisp of black smoke rose from the porcelain, and the sinister grin seemed to melt away. And then, in an instant, the doll went still. The malevolent gleam in its glassy eyes faded, leaving them dull and vacant once more. Its cracked porcelain face seemed to relax, the lines of malice smoothing into a peaceful, almost serene expression. The oppressive weight in the room lifted, the cold receded, and the air felt clean for the first time. We stood there, stunned and breathless, as Mr. Johnson finally explained. The doll was haunted, possessed by the spirit of a little girl named Lily who had died tragically in the house many years ago, a lonely and angry spirit that had latched onto her favorite toy. He was a descendant of the family and had been trying for years to appease her. He believed that by having us, two innocent youths, stir up the mundane dust of the house, it would agitate the spirit enough to draw it out, to make it focus its energy on the doll so he could finally perform the ritual to put her soul to rest. As he spoke, I couldn't help but feel a profound sense of relief wash over me, so potent it made my knees weak. The darkness that had hung over the house like a shroud seemed to lift and dissipate into the evening sky. For the first time since we had set foot inside that cursed place, I felt safe. From that day on, Jason and I never went near that house again. We took the money Mr. Johnson gave us, but it felt tainted, like payment for a service we never wanted to provide. The memory of that porcelain grin and that spectral scream is etched into my mind forever. And now and then, in the dead of night, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if we hadn't stumbled upon that haunted doll. If Jason hadn't been brave or foolish enough to touch it. I wonder if that little girl's spirit is truly at rest, or if she's just waiting in the quiet, dusty silence for someone new to come and play. The year was 2001, and our lives were packed into a chaotic landscape of cardboard boxes and packing tape. We were getting ready to move to a new house in Australia, a world away from the familiar creaks and groans of the home I'd grown up in. A few days before we left, my mother, in a moment of practicality that would unknowingly set a terrifying chain of events in motion, told me to go through the attic and pick out anything I wanted to keep. The rest, she said, would be left behind. The stairs to the attic were a rickety, narrow flight that protested under my weight with a series of loud, complaining creaks as I climbed up. The air grew progressively mustier and colder. The higher I went, the familiar scent of our home giving way to something else, something old and stagnant and forgotten. I had never liked the attic. As a child, I'd imagined it as the house's dark, dusty brain, full of memories I wasn't meant to see. Something about the low, oppressive ceiling and the single grime-caked window that cast a weak gray light always made me profoundly uneasy. But I was older now, and I pushed that childish fear aside as I heaved open the trapdoor and pulled myself into the gloom. Old boxes, monuments to forgotten years, were stacked haphazardly against the walls, some torn open with their contents spilling out like dusty entrails, some still sealed with brittle yellowing tape. A film of grime covered everything, and the air was thick with the smell of decaying paper and dormant spiders. I started digging through them, a reluctant archaeologist of my own family's past, hoping to find some forgotten treasure worth saving. Most of it was junk, worn-out clothes that held the faint, ghostly scent of my younger self, broken lamps with frayed cords, a sad collection of old toys missing arms or eyes, their painted smiles chipped and faded. It was a graveyard of discarded things then tucked away behind a stack of my father's old university textbooks. One box stood out. It was smaller than the others, made not of cardboard but of a dark, heavy wood, with faded floral designs intricately carved into its surface. Unlike the rest of the clutter, it looked like it had been cared for, at least once, a long time ago. Curiosity piqued. I lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded threadbare velvet, was a doll. It was made of porcelain, delicate and pale, with a web of fine cracks spidering across its face like a frozen moment of impact. It wore a simple hand-stitched dress of what might have once been white lace, now yellowed with age. The expression it wore was blank, a neutral canvas of painted features, but somehow it felt aware. Its glass eyes were the most unsettling part. They were an unnaturally clear shade of blue, too focused, too lucid. They seemed to hold a chilling depth, following wherever I moved, not just as a trick of the light, but with a perceived, predatory focus. A small, elegant engraving at the base of its porcelain neck caught my attention. Ella 1978. As I read the name, a sudden cold draft stirred the dust motes in the attic, swirling around me like a ghostly exhalation. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought I heard something shifting in the shadows behind me, the soft scuff of a shoe on wood. But when I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, nothing was there. Just the silent, stacked boxes and the oppressive gloom. I quickly shut the heavy wooden lid, the sound echoing in the stillness, and slid the box back to its hiding place, suddenly desperate to be out of that suffocating space. That night, I had trouble sleeping. My room, a place of comfort and safety for my entire life, suddenly felt alien. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed through the upstairs hallway, even though I knew everyone else was asleep. I'd lie awake, rigid in my bed, listening to them pace back and forth, from my parents' room to mine, a restless phantom patrol. Drawers I knew I had closed before going to bed were left gaping open in the morning, as small, insignificant things began to disappear and then reappear in the strangest of places. Coins I'd left on my dresser would turn up in the sugar bowl. A comb from the bathroom would be sitting on the living room mantelpiece, and even my watch, which I never took off, vanished from my wrist while I slept, only to be found dangling from a light fixture. I told my parents, my voice laced with a frantic edge I couldn't control. They brushed it off with tired smiles and placating words. Moving was stressful, they said. I was probably just tired, my mind playing tricks on me. But the feeling in the house had changed irrevocably. It wasn't just my imagination. The atmosphere grew thick and tense, charged with a watchful energy. It wasn't just noise or missing objects anymore. Sometimes, in my peripheral vision, I would catch a glimpse of something, a tall, dark outline standing in a doorway, a fleeting figure moving past the window even when the curtains were drawn tight. The house no longer felt like ours. It felt like we were intruders in its space. After a few days of this escalating torment, I decided to talk to someone who might actually listen. Someone who wasn't blinded by parental logic. An old man named Mr. Harris lived 2 houses down. The local kids whispered that he was ancient, that he had lived there his whole life and knew the town's history better than anyone. He was our last resort. I went to his house the next afternoon, a small, weather-beaten cottage tucked behind a jungle of overgrown bushes. Mr. Harris, with kind eyes set in a deeply wrinkled face, listened carefully as I told him everything, my words tumbling out in a rush of fear and confusion, from finding the doll in the attic to the pacing footsteps and the shadowy figures. When I mentioned the name engraved on the doll, Ella, his gentle expression hardened. He leaned back in, his creaky armchair, his gaze distant. That doll, he said, his voice low but steady, carrying the weight of old secrets, isn't something you should have touched. He then told me a story, a forgotten piece of local lore that had been intentionally buried by time. He told me about Ella, a girl who had lived in my very house generations ago. She was an outcast, a strange, solitary child who was shunned by her neighbors, feared for reasons nobody liked to talk about openly. Rumors spread about her like a contagion. she could make things happen just by thinking them, that animals would shy away from her touch, that she spoke to things that weren't there. Then one day, when she was just a teenager, she vanished without a trace. The only thing left behind in her room was the doll, sitting on her bed, watching the door. Mr. Harris said the doll was her anchor, her vessel. He warned that if the doll was disturbed, if its long slumber was interrupted, the trouble that had plagued the town all those years ago would start again. "What can I do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Destroy it," he said, his eyes locking onto mine with a grim intensity. "Burn it. Smash it before it grows stronger." I went home with a cold pit of dread in my stomach. My parents, staunch rationalists, didn't believe in ghosts or curses. But after enough pleading, after I tearfully pointed out the ever-increasing oddities in the house, the flickering lights, the cold spots, a window that had inexplicably shattered from the inside, they finally, reluctantly, agreed to help. The fear in my eyes must have finally convinced them that something was deeply wrong. We decided to do it that night. Armed with a heavy hammer and a crowbar from the garage, we made our way back into the attic. This time, we were not explorers, but exorcists. The air was different up there now, heavier, charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. It felt like something was waiting for us. We found the box easily. The wooden lid was slightly ajar, even though I knew with absolute certainty that I had closed it tightly. The doll sat inside, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, facing us as if in greeting. The cracks in its porcelain face seemed deeper, darker, like wounds that were weeping shadow. Before we could move, a powerful, violent gust of wind slammed. The attic trapdoor shut behind us, plunging us into near darkness. The single candle we had brought flickered wildly and then died, its flame snuffed out as if by an invisible hand. But we didn't stop. Fueled by a surge of terror-driven adrenaline, my father reached into the box. He grabbed the doll by its arm. It felt wrong, he told me later, his face pale, like holding a frozen snake, something dead but still filled with venom. He slammed it against the wooden floorboards once, then twice. The porcelain cracked with a sickening sound, but it didn't shatter. I grabbed a heavy old metal pipe I found in a corner and brought it down with all my strength, striking the doll's head. It exploded, shattering into dozens of sharp, white pieces. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the oppressive atmosphere in the attic began to shift. The air grew lighter, clearer, like an immense pressure was slowly lifting off our shoulders. The profound cold receded. We gathered the shards with trembling hands, wrapped them in an old cloth, and, not wanting to leave any trace of it in the house, we took them outside and buried them deep in the earth behind the old shed. The house was different after that. The footsteps stopped. The whispers ceased. The strange movements, the glimpses of shadows in the corner of my eye all gone. It was just a house again. We moved a few weeks later, and I never went back to that attic. But even now, all these years later and half a world away, when I think about that time, I wonder if smashing the doll was really enough. Some nights, when I'm alone in the quiet of my home, I catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those unnervingly clear glass eyes watching me from the dark. Maybe some things don't stay buried as easily as we hope. I never gave much thought to ghosts or haunted objects. To me, those things felt like stories, like clever fictions meant to scare kids around a campfire, not something that could actually bleed into the fabric of real life. That all changed after I moved into my first real home. It was a small place on the absolute edge of town, tucked between a perpetually overgrown lot and a dense stretch of woods that seemed to swallow the sunlight. The house had history. You could feel it in the uneven, slightly canted floors that made you feel like you were walking on the deck of a ship, and you could see it in the worn-out floral wallpaper that was peeling at the edges like sunburnt skin. But I didn't mind the imperfections. In fact, I liked the idea of fixing it up, of sanding down the rough edges and breathing my own life into its old bones, making it truly my own. The first few nights were quiet, filled only with the unfamiliar, sounds of a new place and the rustling of trees in the woods. But about a week in, I was jolted awake by a sound from just outside my bedroom door. It was the sound of slow, heavy, deliberate steps, pacing back and forth in the narrow hallway. Thump ... drag ... drag. At first, I tried to rationalize it away, telling myself it was just the house settling, the old wood groaning and contracting in the cooler night air. That's what old houses do, I reasoned. But still, something about the rhythm of those steps felt deeply wrong. It wasn't random or natural. It felt measured, thoughtful, like someone was walking out there, thinking hard about something unpleasant. Their movements weighted with a heavy purpose. When I finally worked up the nerve to wrench myself from the paralysis of fear, my heart pounding a frantic tattoo against my ribs, and creaked the door open. The hallway was empty, steeped in shadow and silence. I tried not to dwell on it, clinging to logic like a life raft. Old houses make noise. I had bigger things to focus on, like the mountain of boxes still waiting to be unpacked in the attic that desperately needed clearing out. That's when I found the box. It wasn't hidden, exactly, but it was shoved so far back into a dark corner, behind a few rotting mildew-stained suitcases, that it was clear someone had wanted it forgotten. Inside, buried beneath layers of faded moth-eaten cloth, was a doll. It was made of porcelain, with a network of fine cracks webbing around its edges, and it wore a tattered, faded blue dress. But the strangest, most unsettling part was its eyes. They were glassy, painted orbs, staring at a fixed point just past my shoulder, but somehow, they made me feel intensely, uncomfortably seen, as if it was aware of my presence on a level I couldn't comprehend. My first instinct, the rational part of my brain, screamed at me to throw it out, to get that piece of unsettling junk out of my new home immediately. But I didn't. I couldn't. I can't even explain why. It was as if some morbid curiosity, some quiet self-destructive whisper, in my mind, compelled me to place it on a shelf in the spare room. After that, the little thing started to happen, a slow, insidious creep of the uncanny into my daily life. My keys would disappear from the hook by the door, only to turn up hours later inside a kitchen drawer I hadn't opened in days. The television would turn itself on in the dead of night, not to a channel, but to a screen of blaring, hissing static, the sound filling the silent house with its electronic shriek. And then there was the doll. Sometimes, I would find it in different places. Its location shifted from where I had left it. Once, I came home to find it sitting at the very top of the stairs, its glass eyes looking down, as if guarding the upper floor. Another time, I walked into the bathroom to find it perched on the counter, right next to my toothbrush, its painted face a blank mask of silent observation. It didn't feel like a prank, and it certainly didn't feel harmless. Each misplaced object, each instance of the doll's inexplicable migration, felt like a deliberate act, a quiet, escalating campaign of psychological warfare designed to unravel my sanity. One night, I woke up again to the sound of footsteps. But this time, they were different. They were heavier, slower, imbued with a sense of finality. They weren't pacing anymore. They were approaching my bedroom. I lay in bed, every muscle in my body tensed, holding my breath and listening as the slow, deliberate steps came down the hall. Thump, thump, dot 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 thump, stopping right outside my door. The silence that followed was a thick, suffocating blanket. Then, there was a knock. Not a frantic, panicked knock, nor a soft, tentative one. It was a steady, measured, patient knock. 3 solid raps on the wood. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, my mind screaming. Then, from the other side of the door, a voice spoke. It was a high-pitched, strangely flat voice, almost like a poor recording, like someone reading from a script with no emotion, and it called my name. It didn't sound curious. It didn't sound friendly. It sounded patient, possessive, as if it had all the time in the world. I should have called someone, anyone. I should have hidden in the closet, barricaded the door. Instead, in a moment of what I can only describe as terrified insanity, I stood up and reached for the doorknob. The cold brass felt like ice against my skin. The second my fingers touched it, the knocking started again, but this time it was faster, harder, more demanding, a frantic, angry drumming against the wood. I swung the door open. My body braced for anything, a monster, an intruder, the devil himself. At first, there was nothing, just the dark, empty hallway. Then I looked down. The doll sat in the middle of the floor, its legs splayed awkwardly, its head tilted up to stare directly at me. It hadn't been there when I went to bed. I knew that with a certainty that chilled me to my very soul. My body moved before my brain did. I scrambled backward, a choked gasp escaping my lips, fast enough to trip over my own feet and land hard against the dresser, the impact jarring my teeth. The doll didn't move. It didn't have to. Its power was in its stillness, in the horrifying transformation that had taken place. Its painted mouth had changed. Where before there had been a simple, neutral painted line, there was now a jagged, uneven curve, a crude, malevolent mockery of a smile. The cracks on its face seemed to have deepened around this new expression, making it look like a fresh, painful wound. I wanted to believe I was imagining it, that I had finally snapped, that the stress and the isolation had conjured this nightmare. But the air around me felt wrong, heavy and charged with static, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Without thinking, I grabbed the closest thing I could, a heavy glass paperweight from my nightstand, and with a guttural scream of pure terror, I hurled it at the doll. The impact was sickeningly loud in the silent house, a sharp crack as the heavy glass shattered the porcelain head, scattering white shards across the dark wood of the floor. For a single, beautiful moment, I thought it was over. I thought I had won. Then from the pile of broken porcelain, something moved. A twitch, a scraping sound. A tiny, perfectly formed, broken finger pulled itself forward, scratching at the floorboards. Then another. The shattered pieces were trying to pull themselves back together. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I scrambled across the room, grabbed a thick, heavy old book from the bookshelf, some forgotten atlas left by the previous owners, and I slammed it down onto what was left of the doll. Once, twice, again and again, with a frantic, desperate energy, crushing the pieces into smaller and smaller fragments, into dust, until the scraping and twitching finally stopped. I stayed on the floor for a long time, gasping for air, my heart hammering against my ribs, the silence of the house pressing in on me. The house was silent again, but it didn't feel empty. It never would. It felt like I had only silenced a symptom, not cured the disease. The presence was still there, wounded and angry, no longer in the doll, but in the walls, in the floors, in the very air I breathed. And now, it knew my name. My name is Camila, and for 2 years, I lived in a small apartment in Texas with my roommate, trying to build a life for myself. I've always been fond of dolls, even as an adult. They weren't just toys to me, they were silent companions, beautiful objects that reminded me of simpler, safer times. They comforted me. So when my best friend Sarah gave me a doll for my birthday, I was genuinely thrilled. She knew my little quirk better than anyone. But little did I know, this particular doll, this seemingly innocent gift, would methodically and maliciously turn my entire world upside down, dragging me into a darkness I never knew existed. The doll was, by all accounts, beautiful. It was a vintage porcelain piece with big, soulful blue eyes that seemed to possess a liquid depth, an unnerving quality that made it feel as if they were following you around the room. It had a delicate, perfectly painted face, framed by soft brown curls. Sarah said she'd found it tucked away in a dusty corner of an antique shop downtown and thought of me immediately. I was touched by the gesture. I named her Hazel, and she took her rightful place on my bedside table, a silent guardian watching over me as I slept. At first, everything seemed fine, perfectly normal. Hazel added a touch of antique charm to my room, and I loved having her. They're a tangible symbol of my friendship with Sarah. But soon, the subtle strangeness began. It started with small things you could easily dismiss. Objects would move on their own. I'd leave my book on the coffee table and find it on the kitchen counter. My roommate would accuse me of moving her keys. I'd accuse her of the same. We'd hear whispers in the dead of night, faint and fleeting, like the tail end of a conversation in another room. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to our old, drafty apartment building, or just my own overactive imagination. But as the days bled into weeks, the whispers grew louder, more distinct, and the chilling, persistent feeling of being watched became unbearable. It was a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, a sense of eyes on me even when I was completely alone in the apartment. I couldn't shake the insidious, growing conviction that Hazel was somehow behind it all. The feeling intensified whenever I was near her. The air around my bedside table felt colder, heavier, desperate for answers and terrified of the judgment of my friends or family. I turned to the one place I thought might offer some solace without ridicule, the church. I sought out Father Thomas, a kind elderly priest whose calm demeanor I hoped would soothe my frayed nerves. I sat in his quiet sunlit office and told him everything, my voice trembling as I recounted the strange occurrences, my fears and my suspicions about the doll. As I spoke, his expression grew increasingly grim. "Camilla," he said, when I had finished, his voice low and serious, his fingers steepled on his desk. "Some objects, especially old ones with a history, can carry a dark energy. They can act as magnets, as anchors, for malevolent spirits." I shuddered at his words, a cold chill running down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. It was a chill of validation, of knowing I wasn't crazy. Father Thomas offered to come to my apartment, to perform a cleansing ritual, to bless the space and the object. But something stopped me. Despite the visceral fear that now coiled in my gut, I couldn't bear the thought of parting with Hazel. She was a gift from Sarah, a beautiful symbol of our friendship. To admit she was evil felt like a betrayal, and a deeper, more secret part of me was intrigued, drawn to the mystery. So, I politely declined Father Thomas's offer, telling him I needed time to think, and returned home, determined to confront whatever lurked within Hazel on my own terms. That was my gravest mistake. As the nights passed, the activity only escalated, as if my refusal to accept help had been taken as an invitation. I would wake up in the morning with long, thin scratches on my arms and dark, unexplained bruises on my skin, as if I'd been struggling with someone in my sleep. Sleep itself became a distant memory, a luxury I could no longer afford as fear became my constant companion, annoying, ever-present beast. But amidst the escalating terror, a strange and disturbing thing happened. I began to feel a connection. To Hazel it was as if, through the fear and the torment, she was reaching out to me, trying to communicate something I couldn't understand. A desperate, silent plea from behind the veil. I started to see her not as a source of terror, but as a fellow victim, a prisoner just like me. One night, as I lay awake in bed, staring at her porcelain face in the moonlight, I heard her voice for the first time. It wasn't an external sound, it was a whisper directly into my mind, soft and gentle, like the rustling of wind through dead leaves. "Camila, help me, it pleaded. Her painted porcelain lips seemed to move ever so slightly, a trick of the light that was too real to be dismissed. I froze, my body rigid, my mind reeling. Was I finally losing my mind? Or was Hazel truly, impossibly, speaking to me Driven by a dangerous cocktail of curiosity, loneliness, and a hint of madness, I began to communicate with her. I would speak to her out loud when my roommate was out, and she would answer in my mind. We would talk for hours, sharing secrets and fears. I told her about my life, my hopes, my loneliness. She in turn told me of her own. She said she was the spirit of a girl trapped within the doll, lonely and scared. With each passing day, I felt myself growing closer to her, more protective. But as our twisted bond deepened, so did the darkness that surrounded us. The activity in the apartment became more overtly sinister. Strange, complex symbols, drawn in what looked like ash or soot, began to appear on the walls. The air grew thick and heavy with a palpable malevolence, a stench like ozone and decay. The whispers were no longer just whispers. They became growls and mocking laughter that echoed from empty rooms. I knew then that I had made a grave, irreversible mistake. Hazel was not just a doll, she was a vessel, and the thing inside her was not a lost little girl. It was something far more ancient, far more sinister. And I had willingly opened the door and invited it into my life, feeding it with my attention and my sympathy. Terrified and utterly alone, I finally broke. I fled the apartment and ran back to the church, begging Father Thomas for his help. My story now a hysterical, incoherent confession. This time, he didn't hesitate. He arrived at my doorstep not alone, but with a team of paranormal experts, their faces grim and determined, their bags filled with crucifixes, holy water, and instruments I didn't recognize. They were ready to perform an exorcism on my apartment, on the doll. But as they began their ritual, as the prayers in Latin filled the air and the entity within Hazel began to lash out, slamming doors and shattering glass, I couldn't bear to watch. A part of me, twisted and broken, still felt connected to her. She was a part of me now, a dark, twisted reflection of my own loneliness and desires. I had nurtured her. In the end, after a long and violent struggle that left the apartment in shambles and the investigators shaken, it was decided that Hazel was too dangerous to be destroyed, that the act might simply release the entity. She would be placed in a specialized occult museum far away, contained within a blessed case, away from anyone she could harm. As I watched two men carry her away in a locked box, a profound sense of relief washed over me, so intense it brought me to my knees. But even now, as I sit alone in my new empty room, the silence is the loudest sound I've ever heard, and I can't help but wonder, was Hazel truly evil from the start? Or was she just a victim of circumstance, a lonely vessel waiting for a lonely soul to fill her? Perhaps I'll never know, but one thing is for certain, I'll never forget the terror she brought into my life, and I'll never forget the sound of her voice whispering my name in the dark.